Now we're going to take another look at the Prusa MMU2. I hope everyone is well. Chris here back again. Today we are going to take another look at the Prusa MMU2 unit. If you don't know what that is, it's an upgrade that's designed to be used with the Prusa Mark III and 2.5 3D printers that gives you 5 different filament choices that you can use all at the same time to incorporate in the same print. And let's just start out with a quick overview of what this unit looks like and how it works. So here's the MMU2 unit. Let's just walk through how this thing actually works. We'll start from the back. This is where all 5 of the different filaments enter the unit. Now this is not the default configuration. This is one of the upgrades that I like to do on these units. It puts a Bowden coupler on the back so you can unhook these a lot easier. On the original model, they just press fit into a plastic part, and that really isn't all that convenient to use. So I did change that part up. All the things that I changed, the links will be in the description to the parts that you can do this yourself. But the filament enters here and then it gets grabbed by this drum that has idler bearings on it. We'll open up this door so you can have a look. With that open from this side, you can see all the idler gears with the teeth to grab the different filaments. There's 5 different channels like you saw on the back, each one having its own gear. And then from the other side, you can see the drum. As this drum rotates via this stepper motor, that's how it selects each filament. There's 5 of these idlers, so if you wanted the first filament, the drum would roll and mate up with that idler gear, and so on. They're all staggered, so that it can get to each one as it goes through these different positions. It then traps that filament on the gear, feeds it through the front of the unit, into this selector. When a certain filament is called, this stepper motor takes the selector over to the lane that you'd like to use. For instance, lane 1, the barrel initiates and so does the motor to bring the filament from the back through the selector. It enters this chamber where it triggers the fenda probe. This is the first stage in being able to tell if the filament is present or you've run out of filament. And then it feeds the filament down to the printer via this coupler right here. There's a Bowden coupler that hooks up to this, I'll show you that in a second, and sends it on down to the extruder. So in general, that's how the MMU2 works, and I have made videos on it in the past, how you can make it more consistent if you're struggling, but I wanted to do a revisit video for a couple of reasons. The first one being there's a new firmware available that works with the MMU2. Back when the MMU2 was released, there was a feature announced where it would use a blade to cut the end off the filament tip in case you were having issues with it loading. It could reset the filament, get a nice pristine end, and then continue on. That didn't come out until recently, so I want to check that out for sure. The next reason is, over the last year or so, I've had a lot of people tell me that they've never got their MMU2 unit to work, and they just stopped trying. So I'm hoping by this revisit video, maybe we'll go over a few tips that might help those users out, let them try that new firmware, maybe that solves a lot of their issues, and then finally, they can get up and running on their MMU2 with all 5 filaments of their choice. So let's go ahead and check out the new changes in the firmware, see how it's going to benefit us with this MMU2, and then we'll get everything updated. So we'll head over to prusa3d.com and we'll go to the support drivers page. We'll scroll on down, and there is a section for the Mark III, Mark 2.5 Multi-Material 2S unit. It's the same firmware that's going to be found in the Mark III's, but it doesn't hurt to come down here and take a look. Our printer firmware is 3.9.0. Our MMU2 is 1.0.6. This is a major release. Even if you haven't used it on your printer yet, you should probably go ahead and upgrade because they've made a lot of changes that can be useful. You can click down here at the bottom to see the full release log. This will give you all the information you need to know, but let's scroll down to the MMU2 part. They're a bit scattered around this page, but this is the one that I'm most interested in. The selector blade activated. And that does come with a new printed part. They have the link to those printed parts right here. I did print them out. It's a new selector, and the blade holder for the selector, it just grips the blade a lot better. The old version did have a tendency to kick the blade out, and that caused all kinds of issues. Looks like we have a fix for run out of unknown filament. This can happen if the filament is in a certain state when it power cycles. This should help you get around that and get you back to square one. Bug fixes for fenda always triggered. I've never ran into that, but it's good to see the fix. And also power panic improved. So you should be able to recover easier if you're in a print and the power goes out. Looks like they've also improved stealth mode and unload speed has decreased. So the firmware is definitely worth a try. Let's go ahead and download it. We'll head to downloads. We will extract all. And then here's all the firmware we need to update the printer and the MMU2. We can do all this from Prusa Slicer. So we'll just open that up. So let's just start with upgrading the printer's firmware because we're going to have to make some changes to the MMU2. And I don't want to install it yet. So you do have to power your printer on and cable up USB. And since we've already extracted the firmware, we'll just head to Configuration, Flash Printer Firmware. It already knows that our printer's there on COM9. We're going to hit Browse, Downloads, head into the firmware folder, and we have the Prusa Mark III's. There's probably only going to be one of those in there. So we'll grab 390, hit open, and we're ready. We'll hit Flash. Printer screen's going to give you a percentage of how much the update is complete. It's important to not power down during one of these upgrades. The upgrade just takes a couple of minutes, the printer will reboot, and when it's complete you can verify, head all the way to the bottom to support, and there's our new firmware version, 3.9.0. So the printer has been upgraded. Now let's jump to the MMU2 and switch out the selector parts. So my selector is just a bit different from the stock one. I was trying out a few things to try to make it more consistent, but I'm going to go back with the new version, the R2 version that Prusa just released, that holds the blade a lot better. So we're just going to switch this out and the blade cover. So the first thing we need to do is remove these screws that hold this motor on so we can slide it out. With those three removed, the selector should just be on the motor shaft. The motor shaft can come out. We'll just spin the selector off of it. Once that's off, it can just kind of slide out. Then these two shafts should be pretty loose in here. We're just going to remove both of those. This bottom one tends to stick a little bit, but get in there with your pliers if you have to. Try not to mar the shaft. And then your selector is free. Now we're going to remove this coupler here, the fender probe, and this Z-nut. We also have to get out these brass bushings, which can be kind of tricky. Just this top screw to take out your fender. Just notice mine is actually broken right there. We can slide the probe out. There's a steel ball inside here that allows the filament to pass. We'll just take it out and dump it over. There it is. Don't let that get away. There's also a square nut back here. We'll get that out in a second. Let's just take our front coupler plate off here. Again, some square head nuts in there. We'll take those out. Let's remove our trap nut here. And then we have our blade cover, these two screws. Blade cover's off. There's your blade. Be careful, these are pretty sharp. If this isn't a new blade, examine it and definitely consider changing that out. You should get an extra with your MMU2 kit. To note, all the screws on the selector are the same size, so you don't have to worry about which one goes where when you're putting it back together. They're either 10s or 12 M3s. Now we need to take out our bushings. I usually just start it with a Phillips head screwdriver that's a little bigger if they won't come out. Sometimes they'll just slide out and you can grab them on the other side. Once you have the first one out, you can kind of use it to get the second one out. And there we go. Now I'm just going to go around and remove all these square nuts. The only real tricky nut to get out is this one back here. It's actually a hex nut that's been pressed from the back. I usually use an O-ring pick to get the square nuts out. You might be able to get it out with that, or just a really long screw, reach in there and thread it from the back and pull it out. Now we're ready to start assembling version R2. Really the only difference on this version is you have an indent on the cover now that holds the blade in, that squishes it into a little deeper indent on the selector. It also has a little more clearance around the filament path on the selector door right here. So now my hex nut and all my square nuts are back in. I'll go ahead and put my brass bushings back in. I do recommend that you use PETG filament for these parts. It just makes them a little easier to work with. And when you're trapping that probe right here, this part has to bend. PETG will work a little better. So I'll go ahead and put the ball bearing back in for the fender probe. The fender probe can just set in here, smash down for now. We're going to have to adjust it anyway. Put our screw back on. The new part actually has a little window now where you can see the ball and the fender probe lining up. That should be visible while everything's assembled as well. We'll go ahead and put our trap nut back on. Then, working our way around, we'll go ahead and install our blade. The blade sits in there with the sharp side facing down, just like that. And then our door will go on. Now this is just a plastic part, but you do want these screws pretty tight. You don't want it jumping out of here. My blade has actually seen better days, but hopefully we can make it work. So tighten these down pretty good, but you can break this part. So it's kind of a tricky balance to get this just right. We'll go with that for now. And then we'll flip it over. Last thing to install is our coupler. Again, this is where the coupler goes to feed the extruder. And our selector has been rebuilt. We'll go ahead and put our smooth shafts back in. Then we can reattach our motor. And we'll tighten up our 3 screws. And we're all back together. Now we can go ahead and put it back on the printer. But go ahead and take this opportunity if you've been using your MMU2 for a while, clean it out, get all the dust out of it. There are a lot of filament particles that get caught in here. Make sure all the parts are in tip-top shape, reprint a new one if you need to. But this one should be good. We'll go ahead and install it back on the printer. From the back of the machine, all I do is unhook the power wires and the transmit-receive wires and just unhook the whole unit. Remove the Bowden tube, of course. We'll just snap it back on, and then I'll just hook my wires back up over here. The outside one is your transmit-receive 5-volt power, right there. And then next to it is the 24-volt power, right there. But now we're ready to power up, and we'll go ahead and get the MMU2 firmware updated. So we'll cable up to it, USB over here. Back to Prusa Slicer, we'll hit rescan. It found the MMU2. We'll browse for the MMU2 firmware. This one on the bottom, we'll hit open. And we'll hit flash. It doesn't take near as long as the Mark III does. Flash succeeded. Now it's going to go through its boot up, get everything all set, ready to go. After the update's complete, we should be able to go back in, go to support. You'll see MMU connected, and then the firmware, 106. So our upgrade's good, and it's talking to our MMU2 unit. Now let's talk about the extruder setup that I have on this printer. Now Prusa came out with an MMU2 upgrade called the MMU2S. That included all of these extruder parts to help your MMU2 work better. This chimney style filament sensor holder, a little bit different filament sensor, a few other things. The stock MMU2S upgrade, this part right here, just has one of the brass fittings like you saw in the MMU2, where you screw one of these Festo style couplers onto. But it's not a pass-through coupler. I reprinted a part, the top of this right here, that makes you use a pass-through coupler, a 10mm one. I think it works better than the stock one. Again, I'll leave links to these parts. But that way, it lets your tube from the MMU2 go right down to the filament path. So on this side, my filament feeding tube will go right into this coupler, and it goes just a little bit further down inside here. I think it makes things work a little bit smoother. And the other end, on the MMU2, just screws on this coupler right here. And the upgrade and install is complete. So now we've upgraded the parts on the MMU2. I've explained some of the differences on my printer that might not look the same on yours. You might want to check those parts out. And we've updated the firmware on the printer and the MMU2. But we're not quite ready to print yet. There's still a couple adjustments we need to make, and a few things I want to go over with you that might make it easier to use your MMU2. So let's check those out. So let's take a look at the options in the printer LCD screen first. We have upgraded the firmware, so there's probably going to be a few new options available, and there's a few things we need to tweak before we get started. So everything we need to do is probably in settings. Notice we do have a cut filament option now, so that should run the sequence to cut the tip off the filament. We'll head into settings. At one time there was a setting for auto load filament, and you didn't want to do that during the MMU2 mode. I believe now once you install the MMU2 that gets set for you automatically, so no need to worry about that anymore. But if it's in here, make sure auto load filament is off. We want to turn our filament sensor on. That's the sensor down here on the bottom on the extruder. That helps us tell when the filament is at the extruder, ready to bring it in to the hot end. Spool join is an option where you can run out multiple spools of filament. We're not going to do that right now. And we're going to turn on the cutter. This should enable it to cut the tips off the filament. Everything else in here should be good, but you can turn MMU mode to stealth, and it does really limit the noise, but I've had problems with it not being able to get the filament pulled in correctly. So we're going to leave it in normal. Everything else in here should be good. We'll jump back a menu, and we'll go back into support. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you have sensor info. This can be really handy when you're trying to figure out what's going on. You have your Pinda probe, that's the one that does the bed level. It's currently triggered because we're in the home position. You have the Finda, that's the filament runout sensor on the MMU2. And then you have your infrared sensor. That's the filament runout sensor that's in your extruder. So during a cycle, the filament passes through here. We don't have any filament in it right now. It hits the Finda, trips it, then it knows how far it needs to go because it's going to hit that IR sensor next. Once it's triggered, it starts the load sequence. And this can be really handy to help you adjust this IR sensor because that is a problem that I've seen a lot of users have. So let's take a look at the extruder. So on your printer, you can probably just unscrew the Festo right here. I'm just going to pull my Bowden 2 back out real quick. And there's a screw right here, and then one behind it. I like to loosen these up. This top portion should slide on this cover. Right like this. And you want this portion to be all the way to the right before we start adjusting things. So now what I like to do is use a 1.5 hex wrench, a longer one, and trigger the gears inside this housing. So now they're triggered. And if we go back to the screen, you can see that IR trigger is now censored as 1. So back to the extruder, we should be able to just tighten these screws back down and pull the wrench out. Now our IR sensor should trigger back to 0, and it has. But you want to check this multiple times, and this wrench should be more than enough to trigger that sensor. So when you go in, 1, pull it out, back to 0. Check that quite a few times. Move around this housing, make sure nothing's loose, because you want that to be super accurate when you're trying to bring in hundreds of filament swaps. But that is one of the key things to adjust if you're having issues. This one looks pretty good. Now let's check out the fender probe adjustment. So we haven't made any adjustments to the fender probe. This is still loose up here. This is also threaded, so you can kind of adjust this by 1 turn or so. But we also have this window here now, so you can see that ball and the top of the sensor. Still, the easiest way to adjust it is to remove this connector and just grab a spare piece of filament and feed it through the selector. You can see it move that ball. And I like to move the fender all the way down till it's touching the ball, and then move it out about 2 threads. If you have this screw snugged up just a bit, it's pretty easy to just click it out. 1, 2. And then we'll tighten it up. Now we can test it by checking it out on the screen. Back to the menu, all the way to the bottom. Support, the bottom again. Sensor info. Filament isn't present, we're at 0. Filament is present, we're at 1. And you can see that that went back to 0, but we have the filament present. That's what you need to look out for. Watch this screen. The fender is threaded, so we can just back that screw out a little bit, and we'll screw the fender in a bit. And now you can see we went to 1. I know that's probably hard to see on the screen, but I'm actually going to continue to screw it in, maybe 1/8 of a turn, just to be sure, and then I'm going to tighten my screw back up. Now we'll check it again. Let's pull out the filament. We're back to 0. Put the filament back in. We're back to 1. But this is the really important stuff that you need to check. Make sure these sensors are acting accordingly, or you're never going to get those loads correctly. We should be good here, but if you're having issues, come back to this screen and make sure those 2 sensors are functioning properly. Now we are almost ready to print, but there are a few things I want to test, like that cut filament sequence on the menu. But we also need to load up filament, and we need 5 spools. And for this test, I'm just going to use all Prusa PLA, because I can't stress it enough, the more consistent your filament, the better luck you're going to have with the MMU2. So let's get this filament loaded. Okay, I found 5 spools of filament and 5 spool holders. Now I'm going to cut all the tips on all the filament at an angle and feed them into the back of the MMU2. Now this isn't the greatest setup for your MMU2 filament. That is very important. You really need a spool holder that's going to put the filament back on the spool, or you can use the buffer that came with the MMU2S or something you've devised. But filament management is very important. You don't want to get a tangle because that could ruin your print and cause a lot of other issues. But for this setup, it should work just fine. So let's get the whole thing loaded. I like to just push the filament in until they get to the gear. You can kind of see it down in here. And then we'll run the load sequence and feed one in one at a time so we know that it's good to go. All 5 spools have been fed in. Now let's check out the menu and start that loading sequence. We'll just click in from the main screen. Go to Load Filament, and do a Load All. This is going to take all the filament in, touch it to the fender probe, make sure it's there, and put it back ready to print. I recommend you do this before every print just to make sure all the filament is ready to go. So we'll go ahead and start that sequence. We'll just make sure from the back of the MMU2 while it's getting ready to go that we're going to feed them in manually to make sure they hit the gear and then pull it in. It's blinking on 1, it's ready to load the first one. We'll feed it in. It took it. It touched the fender probe. It'll put it back, and we'll move on to 2. Feed it in, fin to probe, put it back. And this is exactly why I tell you to load the filament by hand like this, is because number 5 missed the selector completely and started feeding it out the front. And it won't stop until you intervene. So I hit the center button to stop it, then I hit the left button to move it over to number 4 so I can pull the filament back through and get it fed in correctly. I'll try to straighten it out a bit, recut the tip, and then we'll go again. I'm just going to start that load sequence all over again. It doesn't hurt. And this time on the load, it loaded successfully. And it should every other time now that it's past that guide. It's now in the front of the body, so it'll keep that tip from doing it over. But the initial load might be kind of tricky sometimes. And the last tip that I have for you is to make sure that these 2 screws that hold the door down are even. You want even pressure across all 5 of these tumblers. I recommend getting it flush without any filament in it, and then giving it about 1 more turn. That should be good. Now on the main menu, there is this new cut filament feature. Let's run it just to see what it does. We'll hit cut filament. It's going to ask us what type. We're running PLA. And it's going to start preheating. Now you can pick which filament you'd like to cut. Let's just have it cut number 1. It's going over to filament 1. It's going to load it in. And you saw the movement that it made. It loaded it, it stepped to the side to filament 2, it loaded it a little extra out into the open, ran over, cut it, then came all the way over here to make sure it was still calibrated, and then back to number 1. So that's the process it's going to use if it can't load the filament correctly. It's going to perform that cut on its own. And that should make your MMU2 experience a lot more hands-off. The cut in is actually down here in this trough, and it's very tiny, 10 millimeters of filament or less. But this should save a lot of time messing around with the MMU2. So now we're ready to try a print, just see how much more consistent we're going to be, and maybe even force it to fail, just to see if it'll cut that filament on its own. So let's head into Prusa Slicer and get a model prepared. It's also important to mention that keep your Prusa Slicer up to date. That way you're going to have all the new filament settings if they've made changes, or MMU2 changes if they've made changes there. They do update the profiles on these very regularly, so make sure all those updates are completed. Let's grab us a model. How about this melting Rubik's Cube? If that isn't a challenge, I don't know what is. So we'll extract all, and we're just going to bring all 5 of the parts in all at once. We'll select all 5 and drag them right into Prusa Slicer. It's going to say it detected multiple objects that should be all one piece. Hit yes. And we're going to scale it down just a bit so it doesn't take near as long. We'll do 60%. We'll drag it around, make sure we don't interfere with our wipe tower. I'm going to set the colors to somewhat close to what I'm using. We've got Gentleman Gray, which is actually kind of a green color. We've got Miss Pink, which is a very pink color. We have Mystic Green, which they're not going to have anything close, so let's go with this. We have Silver, don't remember exactly what name that is. And then we have the Royal Blue. So let's just see what it looks like. A pretty wild cube. Now I'm not so worried about the green colors and the blue getting bled into, but I am with the pink and the silver. So I'm going to go to Purging Volumes, and I'm going to go to Advanced just because I think this one's easier to understand. So when I'm changing to pink, I don't want the 1, 3, and 5 colors bleeding into it. So I'm going to increase their transition time. It does make the block a little bit bigger, but that's the only way to keep it from bleeding into my pink color. So I'm going to increase it to 220 for the darker colors. 1, 3, and 5. And same for when I'm changing to my silver color. 220 for 1, probably for the pink as well because it is very bright. 220, 3, and 5. You might have to play with these a bit, but this is just a trial run to see if we can stop some of the bleed, because I know there will be some. So we'll hit OK, and we're ready to slice and put it on our SD card. It is always good to go through the layers just to make sure there's no issues. You can change the infill now if you'd like, which I might bump that down to 10. And I know you see this massive wipe tower over here. That's such a waste of plastic. We'll talk about that more at the end of this video. So let's export our G-code to our SD card. So let's start our file and just see how we do. So we're doing pretty good. We're about 5 hours into this print and we've only seen 2 load failures. And they were at the beginning of the print. And they were both caused by filament runout. So the fenda probe wasn't adjusted correctly. All I did was back out the fenda screw just a bit, give it about a half turn to the right, and we haven't seen any issues since. But I would really like to see a cut sequence. And to get that to trigger, you have to fail load twice in a row. So that's load from the fenda down to the IR probe on the extruder. So now let's see if we can create a false situation to get that sequence to happen. So what I'm going to do after this unload is pull this Festo connector right here. Then I'm going to let the selector go to the next filament, and when it can't load it to that IR sensor, hopefully that will trigger the cut sequence. We've tried the initial load. We have failed the first load. It's going to pull it back in. Once it's been pulled all the way back in and the fenda triggers that there's no filament, it's going to try the second load. Now we're trying the second load. Second load has failed. We're going to pull it back in. The fenda has been triggered. The filament's all the way in. We're going to try a third load. Third load failed. It's going to pull it back in one more time. We've hit MMU needs assistance on the LCD. We've moved over. We've done the cut. Now I'm going to put the Festo back on. The MMU did a bit of homing. Now it's going to try to reload that filament. The LCD said it was going to resume. It's now preheating one more time. The filament starts the reload. It's successful, and we're right back to printing. How cool was that? So the cut sequence does work. And if you're having problems with a certain filament, you can't get that tip shaped just right, it can recover from that after a few misloads. So that's going to save you a lot of intervention on your MMU. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to let this print complete. It takes around 45 hours to complete this one. But what if power off resume actually worked? Can I just turn this printer off, move it somewhere, turn it back on, and let the print complete? What do you say we try it? So the moment of truth, it's been powered down, I've moved it, I've put all the filament back in, I moved it as careful as I could not to bump anything. Let's power it back on and see what happens. It does say blackout occurred, recover print. Let's tell it yes. We're moving back home. And we're preheating. The preheat is completed. Now the MMU is trying to figure out where it is. It's bringing in filament number 2. I believe we were working on filament number 1 when the power went off. And we're back to printing. So let's do some time lapse and see how this goes. Well, that was a terrible idea, and 2 days of my life I'm never going to get back. So a couple things on that one. I never really had any intentions to complete the 45-hour print. I thought I'd go for a couple hours, test out the features on the MMU2, and that'd be it. But I did want to test the power resume feature. So I did turn the printer off, move it very carefully without disturbing X or Y, and all the filament, and I was able to recover from it, and I was pretty amazed by that. I was so sure that it was going to fail that I didn't do anything about the filament spools. I just left them on those stationary holders, and it was a complete mess. You can see during the time lapse, I have to keep going back and checking the spools and fixing the filament. Also, there were a lot of load failures, but they were all caused because the filament would pull out the back. Sometimes the spool holders would even fall on the floor. So I'll never do that process again without some sort of filament management. But the good thing is, it was able to cut the end off the filament quite a few times. There's quite a few tips here in the tray, so that new feature definitely saved me some headaches when doing a couple of these loads. And that's really what we wanted to test here. All in all, I'm glad I completed the print, but I don't think I'm going to be printing with the MMU2 that way anytime again soon. Now we do have this giant white tower that a lot of people don't like. That is a big issue with the MMU2 printing. It is really wasteful. But I am getting ready to start testing a few alternatives to that, and they will be on the channel very soon. So if you have an MMU2, whether you've been successful or not, I urge you to go ahead and try the new firmware, check out the new features, and if you haven't been successful, maybe this will be the feature that gets you up and running. Hopefully you like this video, and I'll see you very soon on the next one.